Conference this morning, new measures of equity. Today we are all privileged to learn from our esteemed colleagues, scholars, teachers, practitioners, advocates, authors, whose commitment to access and equity for students with disabilities has provided leadership, inspiration, and information in the fields of medical and clinical services, civil rights activism, higher ed administration and teaching. So be prepared to be inspired and incredibly well informed by the end of the day. And thank you all for coming from everywhere, from New York, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and we appreciate that you are committed to this subject matter and to this work. I'm Eileen Berger. I'm the Access and Disability Services Administrator for Harvard Graduate School of Education and the Assistant Director of the Office of Student Affairs. So this morning I want to just start out by thanking my Jenny and Cesar, my tech specialists, and just incredible staff in my office, and the Office for, I was going to say the Office for Civil Rights. We'll thank them too. The Office for Student Affairs. And just a few logistics. We have lunch tickets for all of you. When Dr. Lewis finishes her presentation this morning, we're going to ask you all to go upstairs to our wonderful cafe. They have an incredible array of foods, and take whatever you want with your lunch ticket. Bring your lunch back down here because we're going to have a working lunch because Professor Grossman is going to really teach us a lot, as you can see in your folder, and that's the next thing. Your packet contains 3 articles comparing mental health issues among undergraduate and graduate students, Wyatt and Oswald, 2013. We thought this was interesting and good reading for you. Higher Ed and Psychiatric Disabilities, National Survey of Campus Disability Services by Collins and Mowbray. This is a really wonderful study, and it has terrific stats in it. So, and the third article is Innovative and Collaborative Approaches to College Students' Mental Health Challenges by Pinder and Amaker, Harvard Med School, Department of Psych, McLean Hospital. So that's just an overview of some other studies. This morning's conference will focus on mental health and equal access for students with mental health issues and disabilities in higher education. In your article, Collins and May state students with psychiatric disabilities are an increasing presence on campuses, and even though federal policy supports the rights of students with psychiatric disabilities, numerous challenges exist for students and administrators and clinicians. Furthermore, students with psychiatric disabilities remain largely disenfranchised from higher education, and even if aware of services, do not seek them. Health and counseling services, disability services, as well as faith-based ministries are in constant communication and look for ways to collaborate efficiently to provide students with effective modifications and adjustments and model collaborations. Students tell us that knowledge of their civil rights and preservation of their rights to privacy are extremely important to them and become one of the reasons for not seeking support, especially in sustaining their academic and professional status in the pursuit of professional licensure and degrees. We will explore these issues in some depth today, and we have a great panel. I just want to acknowledge Dr. Barbara Lewis, MD, Acting Chief of Counseling and Mental Health Services, Harvard University Health Services. Barbara? Dr. Pata Suyamoto, mental health activist, teacher, and expert on multicultural education, race, and racism. Dr. Suyamoto. Dr. Neil Lipset, clinical psychologist and Dean of Development at Holy Cross. Neil, thank you. Sunny Shang, HGSE alum and current CAS in educational counseling, Sunny. And Sophie Min, Harvard Graduate School of Education, graduate 2014 in human development, in the Human Development Program. And she's also an activist, and these are our 2 student speakers this morning. Good morning. Thank you. and Paul Grossman, our keynote speaker. So that's our panel. And now I'm going to introduce Paul. And some of you know Paul. His reputation precedes him. Be prepared to be inspired and incredibly well informed. Paul will start us out with an overview and the arc of civil rights for students with psychiatric disability and people with disabilities in general. He is a strong voice, a much sought after keynote speaker, and a passionate, knowledgeable voice for civil rights, and a powerful teacher and advocate for people with disabilities. Paul is a professor, an author, a scholar, and a friend. Through his 40-year tenure with the U.S. Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, Paul Grossman has had the unique opportunity to develop and enforce post-secondary disability law in its broader civil rights context. In fact, Paul began his career with OCR addressing segregated schools in Arkansas. Paul worked in OCR headquarters at the time of the writing of the first disability anti-discrimination regulations, and in San Francisco witnessing the historic 504 sit-in at United Nations Plaza. Over his career, Paul investigated, wrote decisions, and settled hundreds of disability discrimination cases, in many instances developing new approaches to protecting post-secondary students with disabilities. Recently retired from OCR, Paul starts his second decade as an adjunct professor of disability law at Hastings College of Law, University of California, where he uses his recently published disability law book. On the back of your program. It's a wonderful resource, and I suggest that you consider this as a resource for your offices. I certainly have the last book and have this one as well. And Paul, it's all yours.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eileen. So you all are going to give me a second chance to get this right. Welcome to Harvard. I don't know if I got it right. It's okay. So I thank you for the introduction, Eileen. I just want to also add I'm on the board of directors of HEAD, which is, for many of you, the professional organization that you belong to. I'm also a member of CHAD, which is the organization for students with ADHD. And I would just like to add, the reason that I joined CHAD shortly after I retired is after students with psychiatric disabilities, I think students with ADHD face the greatest prejudice, the most harassment, the largest number of barriers, the least insight and understanding, and even more so in the elementary and secondary level. And actually, the single largest number of cases, complaints, which OCR receives, are on behalf of students with ADHD in the secondary setting. So it's a big challenge, and we're just starting to get research into the concept of executive functioning and executive functioning skills. And I think the challenge for us down the road is going to be, okay, let's say this really is what ADHD is about. It's about executive functioning skills. What are appropriate accommodations for individuals with challenges in this area? And I think we got a lot of work and research left to do. And I also need to disclose, because Disability Rights Advocate sues many of you from time to time, that I am the expert advisory board of Disability Rights Advocates. And thank you for the plug for the book. And I just want to add a quick discussion of why it's here, and I promise not to plug the book anymore. And by the way, I make a whole $1.50 off of each book, and I donate the $1.50 back to a head. So I'm not here to make money. I published with Ruth Coker, a very distinguished professor at Ohio State University, the leading textbook for law students in disability law. And of course, we cover, soup to nuts, employment to the internet. But I realize that for people in the higher ed field, the book is both too broad, too expensive, and not deep enough on the issues that really most matter to you. So Ruth and I took our $170 book and kept the chapter on Introduction to Disability Law, kept the chapter on who is an individual with a disability, kept the chapter on employment discrimination because I realized some of you do HR advising, and then we doubled the size of the chapter on higher education. And so it's only, I think, $44 for the digital version, and I wrote it to be useful to you. That's why it's there. So I hope you will seriously consider purchasing it. And again, I promise I won't plug it again today. I need to prove I'm a lawyer, so I need to tell you I'm not giving you legal advice, right? And the real reason, of course, is once I retired, I stopped carrying malpractice insurance. You're very welcome to share whatever PowerPoints are handed out today with colleagues on your campus. But if I see it up on the internet, I'm going to come to your school and shoot you. So, okay. So today, we're going to cover two interesting trends in the law. One is the fact that we're going to have a larger and larger population of individuals with psychiatric disabilities. And even though we've done a fair amount of thinking about this issue, we clearly have a great deal more to do. And I'm going to present to you the philosophical issues and the philosophical case for why we want to commit to admitting students with psychiatric disabilities and supporting students with psychiatric disabilities so they persist in their education to the point where they can become self-sufficient professionals. This afternoon, I'm going to talk about the other side of the coin, so to speak, which is the issues of discipline and safety. And then we're going to get into an entirely different area, except I hope we can tie them up together in the end. The entirely different area is the single biggest issue in post-secondary disability law right now is the digital world. Your websites, your internet, your alternate media production. And we're going to spend a full hour on that. But the thesis that I want to develop with you is, it used to be that the body of the dog was the law of reasonable accommodation for students with disabilities, and the tail was the internet, your online learning system. It was a small, minor area of the law. But interestingly enough, I tell individuals in this area, so I've lectured recently to software engineers, for example, the tail is starting to wag the dog. And what I mean by that is that concepts developed to be accessible in that area. The measures of equality are new ones. I'll give you an example, ease of use, right? So those new measures are now starting to come back into the body of the dog. That is, those measures of equity or equality are now being used to look at other areas outside the internet, outside the digital world. So one of the most important new measures is independence and self-sufficiency. Can the student access your online learning independently, even though they're blind, even though they're deaf? They do it independently. Well, one of, I think, the most interesting questions is, what would independent and self-sufficient accommodation mean for students with psychiatric disabilities? How would we go about both supporting this population, but also helping this population to reach independence and self-sufficiency, which seems to me is the ultimate goal of the accommodation process? So I'll put a pin in that one, but I'd like you to think about this question throughout the course of the day. Students with psychiatric disabilities are the least understood and least supported group of students in post-secondary education. That was the conclusion reached in a study just published in AHEAD this month by Kupferman and Schultz. And I'm going to go into that study in some detail in just a minute. But the conclusion was based upon your feedback, your response to a very wide-ranging survey that was sent out by AHEAD to, I think, 400 disabled student services directors. And we come up with this rather disturbing information. Approximately 80% of students with psychiatric disabilities withdraw prior to degree completion. That's a huge percentage. And it's more than double that of students without disabilities. It's almost even double that of students with disabilities. So this is clearly a group that is both profoundly impacted by its disabilities and also profoundly impacted by the fact that we don't yet have all that many good approaches to supporting them through their education. And the upshot of that is, even though the unemployment rate for individuals with disabilities is astonishingly high, 50%, for people with psychiatric disabilities, it's 90%. A really disturbing number. So my goal today is to start a deliberate and explicit conversation among AHEAD, Disabled Student Services Directors, the other kinds of professions that we have here represented by NASPA, NACUA, NACADA, about how can we successfully support these students, but also how, as an interdisciplinary approach or an interfunctional approach, can we work together to support this function to help turn these numbers around. And I hope that you will take some information back today to your campus to start this conversation on your campus. It takes a campus. I don't mean to rip off Hillary, but it takes a campus. So you've had in your handouts this morning some very good and interesting articles pertinent to this. I just want to recommend two other, because I want to admit that this morning I'm not only talking about the law, right? And so I'm kind of outside my area of expertise. As I say, I might have stated a Holiday Inn Express in some areas of this subject. But nonetheless, I found these two publications to be particularly helpful. So the first one is a book, and it has about, 15 or 20 scholarly articles in it. But what it does is it takes each of your campus functions, student health service, psychiatric services, counseling, advising, DSS, and talks about each of these functions and what the challenges are. And then this extraordinarily good survey that just came out in JPED. So if you're a member of AHEAD, you can access JPED for free, right? And I suggest you print out the article and share it with your colleagues. That's what I think you should do. So they looked at how prepared are disabled student services to deal with the responsibilities that are brought about by students with psychiatric disabilities. And the answer was, we have a long way to go. But it's a very insightful and thought-provoking survey, and the analysis of it runs very deep. You may also want to go to these websites. So I assume most of you know of NAMI, which is probably one of the two leading advocacy organizations on behalf of students with psychiatric disabilities, or individuals with psychiatric disabilities. My favorite, the Bazelon Center. Bazelon Center is named after Judge Bazelon, who was really a trailblazer on the behalf of the rights of individuals with mental health challenges. And it's an advocacy organization, but it's also a very good training organization. I help them in a number of ways. One was we recently worked on a brief together with AHEAD. Bazelon Center had put together a brief in a case that I'll discuss this afternoon. And then there's the JED Foundation, which specifically focuses on the issue of students with psychiatric disabilities in higher education. If you're an AHEAD member and you haven't met Barbara Blacklock, you should introduce yourself to Barbara Blacklock. She comes to all the AHEAD conferences. And she is at the University of Minnesota, and her specialty is individuals in the medical professions with psychiatric disabilities. And she has some very, very good programs. Okay. So there are going to be more and more students with psychiatric disabilities on your campus. Part of this is advances in pharmacology. Part of this is the fact that more people are now able to get health insurance and get treatment. Part of this is the fact that in the elementary and secondary level, they're entitled to a free, appropriate public education, which means that they will be getting more support as they go through school. And this means that more individuals will have, quote, the emotional stability necessary to enter and persist in college. So let's think about this. We're not trying to cure people. We're not trying to insist that people are free from symptoms. We're not trying to ensure that people are well. We are trying to see to it that we can give people enough support that they will have the emotional stability to persist through school. Another reason why this population is increasing is because as we admit other populations with disabilities, these are comorbid conditions. So for example, ADHD, which I know well, I know some research suggests that 40% of individuals diagnosed with ADHD have as a secondary disability medical condition depression or obsessive compulsive disorder. So this is a pretty high number. Then in addition, those of you who know me know that I work very, very hard on behalf of wounded warriors. Having looked at a lot of research in this area, I think it is conservative to say that 40% of Iraq-Afghan vets are going to have some kind of cognitive disability, TBI, PTSD. And for that population, particularly the PTSD population, there's also a high level of alcohol addiction and 18 suicide attempts per day. One successful suicide, if I can use the word successful in that way, per day. More of our troops kill themselves than are killed by our enemies in Iraq and Afghanistan. Right? So if you have a veterans program and you're not concerned about individuals with psychiatric disabilities, you're missing a very important component. And according to a number of articles that I've read, the severity of the psychiatric disabilities, the individuals who are making it into post-secondary education, is trending up. And that's kind of logical because we have better interventions. More and more individuals are going to be able to come to college or university. Numbers are easy to come by, but they're not consistent. So I know, Neil, you're probably going to have a different set of numbers than I do. Put them up. Because what I can tell you is they're all over the place, right? And I'm going to give you some contradictory numbers in the next slide, right? So the most common estimate I hear is 11% of students in higher education are individuals with disabilities. And approximately a quarter of them are individuals with psychiatric disabilities. So now I'm going to give you a different number. So this is a survey done every 3 years of over 95,000 students. So it's a big survey, right? 18.4% report sometime during their 4 years in college they experience deep depression. Right? That's a pretty big number. Of those, almost 40% are taking some kind of medication. A quarter, and this is I think a low number therefore, I'd like to see the higher number, were receiving psychotherapy. Almost 10% considered committing suicide in the past year, and about 1.3% actually attempted it. So we're going to talk quite a bit about self-destructive individuals this afternoon, or self-injurious individuals. And note what goes with this: substance abuse, that kind of thing. 80% of students in these categories may be receiving no treatment whatsoever. Another survey, this survey covered 28,000 students who are in the counseling center. So this is a subset of individuals, right? 8% had attempted suicide at some time. 35% were on medication. 9% reflected some form of PTSD. I want to go back to PTSD for just a second. Because of my work with wounded warriors, I've worked with a lot of individuals with PTSD. And I just, want to say on behalf of those individuals, this is an incredibly challenging, debilitating disorder. And I had one individual, for example, who told me that the VA had given him a large German Shepherd to go with him on campus. And I said, well, what does the German Shepherd do for you? And he said, I send the German Shepherd into the classroom ahead of me to make sure there's no IEDs in the classroom. And for that individual, this was a really serious concern. He also told me, I won't park in a parking structure because every single empty vehicle in that power structure is a potential IED from how that individual is experiencing it. And we will talk more about PTSD this afternoon. So I want to talk just about impact. And to me, a lot of this is about energy. No? So think about, like, how hard is it to get up in the morning and get to class? How hard is it to have done your homework? How hard is it to have paid attention in class? Impaired short-term memory skills, reduced ability to elaborate, difficulties with planning, organizing, and regulating learning, all executive functioning skills, right? Then those individuals who are taking medication, that's also going to impact things like concentration and stamina. And then as we do our panel this morning, individuals are going to talk to you about stigma, right? So I have students in my classroom who out themselves as individuals with psychiatric disabilities, but my classroom is a classroom full of individuals with disabilities. Imagine if you're in a classroom where your concern is the math professor is going to be hostile to you if you reveal your disability, or you want to become a teacher, and the lectures already talked about how people with psychiatric disabilities shouldn't be teachers. They're going to experience more stress, more exhaustion, less pressure, less pleasure, and they're going to get lower grades. Twice as likely, well, I think it's 4 times as likely to drop out. Over 2,000 hospitalizations a year, nearly 120 suicide attempts a year. I'm sorry, nearly 120 suicides a year, many more attempts. Neil, do you have a number for suicides a year? It's a different number, though, I'm going to guess. Yeah. So I'm not surprised at this, right? I'm not surprised at this. I think we can agree self-injurious behavior is a very big issue. And by the way, it's an extremely ethically and legally complicated issue. And so we're going to really drill down on that this afternoon. Okay. So the case for admitting and supporting students with psychiatric disabilities. So I might sound a tad hyperbolic as I start this, but I think as we work through for the next 10 minutes or so, you're going to say, oh, maybe you got a really important point here, Paul. A society that does not respect the rights of its most vulnerable individuals, individuals with psychiatric disabilities, may destroy itself from within. So this is a picture that was taken by a very famous photographer, August Sandler. And it was just before the rise of the Nazi government. And Sandler's book is about this thick, and on the first page he has the most venerated individual in German society, and then in the bottom page are the people who are least respected. And the people who are least respected, this is the picture. And what you have is an individual who is blind being led by an individual who has an intellectual disability. So how does a government get from being a democracy, which Germany was, not taking anybody's life except perhaps as a result of criminal conduct? How does that society get to the point where people think a normal, routine, legitimate function of a government is to exterminate its own people? That does not happen overnight. People have to come to accept that this is a role of government. So how did this transition, how did this normalization of mass murder come about? It started with the concept that German society was going to remove all the bad genes from the gene pool by killing people with severe psychiatric disabilities and people with intellectual disabilities. And this was done as part of German medical practice. People were institutionalized, and in those institutions, first people were sterilized, and then they were euthanized, like you would do to a dog. And it was through this process that the whole concept that a legitimate role of government is to kill off thousands of people and purify the gene pool. And even more disgusting than that is the fact that you can't kill off 5, 6 million people unless you know how to do it efficiently. What is a quick, cheap, efficient way to kill another human being? Where did they learn to do this? They learned to do it on people with psychiatric disabilities and intellectual disabilities. This is where the whole concept of mass murder came about. 200,000 people killed in psychiatric hospitals by the end of the Nazi regime. And just in case you think America's hands are totally clean, the Nazis got their sterilization codes from Virginia law. And at the same period in the United States, we were committing 30,000 lobotomies in 1936. And in those days, lobotomy was essentially done by taking something that looked like an ice pick, sticking it up the nose, and removing the part of the brain till you were a totally docile, vegetable kind of human being. So do I think that we will have a disability holocaust in America? No. And that would be hyperbole. But let me make the case for just how serious things are. Unemployment rate for individuals with disabilities, 50%, 25 years after the ADA. Unemployment rate for people with psychiatric disabilities, 90%. Dropout rate for students with psychiatric disabilities, triple that of students without disabilities. The Supreme Court of the United States has been so hostile to the rights of individuals with disabilities that they twisted and squeezed the law in such a way as no person could go into court and meet the definition of disability unless they were so disabled they were virtually unemployable. 90% of all people who went into federal court in an employment discrimination complaint had their complaint dismissed without ever getting to the merits. Were you accommodated? Weren't you accommodated? Were you qualified? Weren't you qualified? Never got to that issue because the case was dismissed on the grounds that you're not an individual with a disability. And Congress actually had to pass a law in 2008 telling the Supreme Court, you got it wrong. Your rules of statutory interpretation are wrong, and we're going to set up a new set of rules. And those rules have a huge impact on individuals with psychiatric disabilities. So we're going to go into them in a little while. The equivalent of Brown v. Board of Education, Olmstead versus LC, was ruled on in 1990. Less than 25% of all the desegregation that was intended has occurred between 1990 and now. So we still have large institutions warehousing people with, for want of a better word, serious disabilities, including individuals with intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. Our criminal justice system is a disaster. So every time I see on TV the issue of police shootings, white police officer, victim of color, and by the way, is everybody like seated securely in their seat? I'm going to shock you. I used to be an Oakland police officer. Okay, so I have some very strong feelings about these issues and some very strong insights into these issues. But here's the insight I want to share with you this morning. In many, many, many of these cases, the individual shot is an individual with a disability. I'm not even sure that this isn't as much about disability as it is about race. If there was ever an issue where people of color and people with disabilities needed to get together on criminal justice reform or on reform in this society, this is the issue. Our prison system is our mental health system. That's it. That's our mental health system. The warden of Rikers Island says, I run the biggest mental health institution in the state of New York. Imagine being an individual with a psychiatric disability in prison. What's the primary way they control people who act up? Stick them in isolation, right? What's the best way to get somebody to fall apart? Is the word decompose? Decompensate? I'm sorry, decompensate, thank you. Stick them in isolation. We are torturing people with psychiatric disabilities for the manifestations of their disabilities when we stick them in prison. Persons with a history of psychiatric disabilities are often denied entrance into the legal profession and as jurors. So they can't get into the systems that people have historically used to secure their civil rights. Right? Everybody knows the great things done by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP, Inc. But Thurgood Marshall does get to practice law. Right? People with psychiatric disabilities can make it all the way through law school and then not get admitted to the bar because of their history of a psychiatric disability. Federal courts have found that the emergency evacuation plan for neither New York nor LA has any meaningful provision for individuals with disabilities. Note, of the 4 groups that are most excluded in these plans, 2 of them are persons with intellectual disabilities and persons with psychiatric disabilities. So we're always thinking about, well, if there was an earthquake in San Francisco, what would we do for people in wheelchairs? That's a good, important question. So is it, what are we going to do with people who need to get health care because of the trauma of the earthquake? The United States is supposed to be the world's leader in disability rights. And I think it is. By the way, I have to say San Francisco is a great deal more accessible than New York. I was really shocked when I was in New York last week seeing how inaccessible the subway system is, for example. In any event, we may be the world's leader, but what's the one industrial country in the world that will not sign the UN Convention on the Rights of Individuals with Disabilities? United States of America. We have a long way to go. And I ask this question because I think it's very important to us as we discuss this subject today. If we don't admit, support, get into the professions, get them, all the way through, individuals with psychiatric disabilities, who's going to fight for their rights? And the answer is no one is going to fight for their rights as well as they will. We have what we call the anthem in the disability rights movement. Nothing about us without us. And I think of my own class at Hastings, where I have a student who said, Professor Grossman, you don't know what it's like to be involuntarily committed in California. You know what? Blessedly, he's right. I don't know what it's like to be involuntarily committed in California. But he does. And that's why I want to see him be admitted to the practice of law in California. So I think that's one of the pillars of the argument for supporting individuals with psychiatric disability. The second one is the diversity argument. So the Supreme Court of the United States reads the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, the 5th Amendment to the United States Constitution, and says, only under the rarest of circumstances would it be constitutional for federal or state government to take race into account in any action it takes? What's the one compelling argument that even the Supreme Court recognizes as an exception to that concept? The one exception is if necessary to achieve diversity in education. They recognize, just like that experience I had in my classroom, that a classroom of all white males is not going to give anyone an adequate education. Not the people excluded, not even the people included are going to get an adequate education. And I say individuals with disabilities are as important to diversity as is gender, color, race, sexual orientation. And I'm not trying to rank them. I'm not saying one's more important or more necessary than the other. What I am saying is they're all necessary. But the message I want you to take back to your campus is, hey, when we have Diversity Day, when we honor diversity, let's make sure that part of that is honoring the contributions of individuals with psychiatric disabilities. And the other argument for diversity is that when we stretch, so to speak, to open ourselves up to a greater variety of individuals, people with more cultural differences across a greater spectrum, we improve the quality of our educational system. So my favorite example is Guckenberger versus Boston University, about which I could spend an hour talking. But I'll try to be succinct in my example. So Boston University began to make it difficult for individuals with dyslexia and other learning disabilities to be successful at Boston University. And one of the things that they did is they stopped allowing students at Boston University to take alternative programs to learning a foreign language, course substitution. So at one time at Boston University, if you didn't want to learn French, you could take literature of France. If you didn't want to learn Spanish, you could take the economics of Spain. And they decided, no, every single student is going to learn a foreign language. So students with disabilities challenged that. And what the court said to Boston University was, before we rule on the motion of the students, we want you to go back and ask yourself this question: why do we require learning a foreign language? And is there any other way that you could achieve this same goal? And in fact, could you not achieve this same goal simply by literature of Spain? So Boston University conferred, and they met on it, and they went back into court, and they said, Your Honor, we've decided there's no substitution for learning a foreign language. But in the course of looking at this question, we learned that there are 3 or 4 basic approaches to learning a foreign language. And at Boston University, we've only been using one. And we're going to start offering multiple sections where we say, right in the course catalog, this is the approach to instruction we're going to use. Now, who benefits from this? Well, students with a language processing disorder called dyslexia are certainly going to benefit from it. But so is every other student at Boston University. And so one more reason why we should be admitting students with disabilities, including students with psychiatric disabilities, is because we want to improve the quality of our instruction for every student. And this is one of the ways in which we do it. Okay. We've been philosophical. Let's get legal for a second. And I told you that Congress changed the definition of disability to overcome the problem that the Supreme Court had created. So this is the impact of the ADAAA, or as we say in the field, ADAW, which is amendments to the ADA that Congress passed in 2008. So this is the definition of disability, and it was before 2008, and it is now. But they tell my students, the words are the same, but the tune has changed. What I mean by that is the rules of interpreting what these words mean has changed. So how have the words changed? So you'll note there's 3 states of disability here. You are an individual with a disability, you had a record of being an individual with a disability, or you're regarded as having a disability, irrespective, by the way, of whether you actually have a disability. This is regarded as. Okay, and so let's talk about this. First of all, Congress instructs the courts to focus on discrimination rather than the definition of disability. They're telling you, let's get to the merits of the case. Note the word back here, substantial. A physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So what's the impairment? The impairment is generally the diagnosis the doctor gives you. So depression is an impairment. Got it? Schizophrenia is an impairment. So the question is, do you have an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity? What's a major life activity? Walking, talking, eating. Okay? So substantial was made by the Supreme Court to mean really, really a lot. And Congress said, no, we really only mean this much. Material, not overwhelming, not huge, not gigantic. And then Congress expanded what is a major life activity, and we're going to get into that in just a second. So substantial is no longer a demanding standard. No, an impairment that is episodic or in remission is a disability if it would substantially limit a major life activity when active. So people with bipolar disorder could not qualify as individuals with disabilities. Now they're telling you, yes, they can, right? Repudiation of the Sutton Trilogy. What that means is, Supreme Court said, if an individual is taking a medication, you look at them in their medicated state. So if the medication is working well, you're not an individual with a disability, right? The fact that the employer doesn't want you because you take your medication, too bad. Now the Supreme Court is saying, Congress is saying to the Supreme Court, no, you cannot take the mitigating measures into account. So I used to show a picture of a vet who had lost her legs, and she had prostheses. And thanks to prostheses, she could walk. So guess what? She's not an individual with a disability. Now it's like, look at the individual without the prosthesis. Look at the individual without the medication. Then Congress expanded the nature and number of major life activities. So it used to be when I had cases in behalf of people with psychiatric disabilities, I had to use sleeping and learning as the major life activity. This person's impairment is depression. It substantially limits what? So I would say, well, thanks to the medication they have to take, it substantially limits sleeping. The medication interferes substantially with sleeping. Or thanks to the bipolar disorder, even with medication, they have a substantial impairment of learning. It was a stretch. Look what got added. Concentrating and thinking. Now there's a radical idea. Thinking is a major life activity, right? I laugh now, but I have to tell you, one of the things that pushed Congress into passing this new law was because courts were saying thinking was not a major life activity, right? We used to have a T-shirt in the disability rights movement. We used to say, thinking is a major life activity, right? And here's another one that affects the population you're talking about today, ability to get along with others. And by the way, this doesn't mean you can't get along with just your one boss or your ex-wife or whatever. It means you can't get along with most people, okay? Okay. So here's the really important thing to know. Then the EEOC said, okay, given these new rules, we can now label some impairments as always being disabilities. Yep, are you with me? The impairment, like bipolar disorder, is an impairment. We had to show that it substantially limited, in the old days, learning. Now we can say thinking. Okay. They added as major life activities neurological systems and brain functions. And as a result, Now, intellectual disabilities, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, PTSD, OCD, and schizophrenia are all per se disabilities. So if a student comes into your office with a diagnosis from a qualified doctor that says, so-and-so has major depressive disorder, that's it for an individual with disability. Now, what doesn't this tell you? This is a very important thing. What doesn't this tell you? Doesn't tell you what are their functional limitations. And because it doesn't tell you what their functional limitations are, you still may need more information to put together the reasonable accommodation, right? So it's not that it makes all your work really, really easy for this population, because you still have to be skilled in putting together an accommodation. And indeed, I would say, based on the survey of DSS directors that we talked about, as a field, as a group of individuals getting together to solve a problem, we really need to know more about what accommodations are or are not effective. Just by way of example, here's something I don't know that I wish I knew. Is it better for some disabilities, instead of giving time and a half on an exam or double time on an exam, to give them the same amount of exam time as everyone else, but give them breaks? Right? It might be that actually breaks are more effective or helpful than is time and a half. Or maybe instead of getting double time, they should get time and a half, but time and a half plus breaks. And I just don't know, and I don't think you know, the answer to that question. It's the kind of research and thinking and investigating that we need to be doing. And the most important thing from some people's perspective is it uncouples the prongs. What the heck does uncoupling the prongs mean? So I got to go back just a little bit. So here's how learning can be so nasty. You see the word such there? Okay. Being regarded as having such an impairment. So such could mean an impairment like bipolar disorder. Or such could mean an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. Can you see how those are two very different things? And here's why. An employer says, I don't want to employ her anymore. She's a nut job. I don't want that nut job in my classroom. So the victim sues, and the victim can prove that the professor regarded her as having a psychiatric impairment, but maybe can't prove that the professor was thinking, oh, this must limit the major life activity of learning. Because that's a really, really high burden of proof, which, by the way, is why prong 3 was virtually worthless for people with psychiatric disabilities. Ironically, though, that's the prong most people with psychiatric disabilities wanted to argue about. Why? Because they weren't trying to get an accommodation. They were merely trying to get non-discrimination. Don't create a hostile environment for me on the basis of my disability. Just leave me alone. I don't need any special treatment. Just leave me alone. Stop marginalizing me in front of the class. Right? If you qualify under prong 1 or prong 2, you're entitled to accommodation. If you qualify under prong 3, you're not entitled to an accommodation. You are entitled to non-discrimination, including freedom from a hostile environment on the basis of disability. So what has happened is, on your campuses, if you have a student who comes in and says, I'm tired of being marginalized by my professor, all they have to do is be regarded as having an impairment, and they are legally protected, which, by the way, means they didn't need to register with your office. Right? Think of this more like race, national origin, gender discrimination. Right? Because that's what prong 3 is for. We're doing for time. Oh, I'm way out. Okay. So I want to talk very quickly about the most commonly recognized accommodations, and then I guess I need to shut up. Yes? Are we starting at 10, the next group? Okay. So I'm going to do this, and then I'll close out. So I've read a lot of literature in this area. And I want to tell you, the single most effective accommodation is a reduced course load. Now, I know that's problematic for many reasons. Financial aid. If you're a vet, you only get 36 months of support, and then you're on your own, right? Students want to keep up with their peers. You probably have minimum course load rules, which, by the way, are subject to the duty to accommodate. By the way, the fact that you have a rule in writing doesn't mean it can't be or shouldn't be accommodated, right? So you may have a rule, our minimum course load here is 8 credits. Okay, and with the duty to accommodate, it might have to be 6 credits, right? The fact it's in writing doesn't make it sacrosanct, okay? The nice thing is, thanks to technology, a lot of people now can carry a reduced course load and make it up over the summer on an online course, right? So it's become more feasible. Note takers are helpful, exams in a quiet space, extended time for assignments, extended time for exams, or refresh time, right? We're still looking at this. Flexibility in dropping courses. Again, the fact that you have a rule that says you can't drop a course after the 3rd week doesn't mean the duty to accommodation, doesn't mean you're going to have to let a student drop in the 5th week, right? Flexibility in scheduling exams, flexibility in excusing absences, flexibility in withdrawal or even retroactive withdrawal. For veterans, I have a long list, and we don't have time to go through the whole list, but I just want to point out one of the first ones is a safe parking space, right? A safe classroom location. Permissions to bring in assistance animals, and we'll talk about service animals and assistance animals this afternoon. To me, the single most helpful thing you can do for vets is to have a real, at least open for 12 hours a day, vet center where they can meet and support one another. And I do not mean a place where you can go and get financial aid as a vet. That's helpful. I mean a place where vets can support vets. Because the mentality of vets is what's called unit mentality. And they are going to be your best source of support, even for individuals with TBI and PTSD. Okay. And I think I'll cut there, and we'll put what works up this afternoon. Okay? Because we have a panel to do. I'm just going to flash through so that we can get to the next people. And I'll share that this afternoon. Thank you.